Hi, everyone. Welcome to Beaconsfield Podcast, Episode 4. It's my absolute pleasure today to be speaking with Tarunabh Khaitan. He's Professor of Public Law and Legal Theory at Wadham College, Oxford. He's Vice Dean of the Faculty of Law at Oxford. And beginning this year, I believe, he's the Head of Research at the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights. So thank you so much, Professor Khaitan, for coming on today.
Well, thanks very much, Jack, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Just a quick correction. I'll be starting at Bonavero Human Rights Institute in July this year. I haven't begun yet.
Wonderful. Well, there we go. We got something to look forward to. So Tarun, this is a show about institutional reform and cultural change. But I always like to begin by asking my guests to tell us a little bit about themselves. So without being overly dramatic, could you share us a bit about your story with us? How did you get to where you are now? What were the formative moments in your life that led you to think about discrimination, democracy, and institutional reform?
Yeah, so I think I'm here because of a series of accidents. I don't come from an intellectual family. In fact, quite the opposite of that, and grew up in a small town in India before the internet. And frankly, sort of books were a commodity there. So I went to law school because a city cousin who was visiting passed on the law school prospectus to me. And I sat for the law school exam, got in to this big law school in Bangalore. And that opened up the world. It was just an astonishing change from a small town where, small by Indian standards, there's still quite a lot of people, but a small town where your imagination is limited by the possibilities of other lives that you see around you, to a big city and an ambitious law school where you at least know of, if not even meet in flesh and blood, people who have done amazing things. So that was quite a dramatic and entirely serendipitous change, sort of a turning point in my life. I guess the move to the academy, I enjoyed what I was doing in law school. I loved reading and I loved ideas. And as a second year student, I was interning with a union of farmers and rural farmers and laborers in rural Rajasthan. This was 2001, I believe. And it's an amazing organization called Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan, whose founder, or one of its founders, is this incredible lady called Aruna Roy, who was a former bureaucrat, left the state service to organize some of the poorest and most oppressed sections of the Indian people. And that was an eye-opener too, because I just loved their work. I loved what they were doing. And Aruna herself lives in this mud hut on minimum wage, or she used to then, like the people she was working with. So I remember distinctly and vividly this evening where she's sitting on this wooden stove and making rotis for her interns in this little mud hut. And she's asking us one by one what we want to do with our lives. And I tell her that, I'm thinking of becoming a scholar. In a very distinctive, thoughtful, and kind style. There's a moment of silence, and then she says, democracy needs its scholars, but make sure you write in a way that the people understand, right? And they were both important lessons, the role of an intellectual in democracy, and how we write matters as much as what we say. So I think those were my formative experiences.
So when you went to Oxford and you studied there afterwards, how did that change your perspective on what you had learnt in India growing up, thinking about democracy and discrimination? What did Oxford do for you with your thinking?
In some ways, the move from my small town to Bangalore was a bigger cultural shift. then from Bangalore to Oxford.
Right.
Intellectually, Oxford was amazing. The rigor that it brought to my thinking, learning that it's not enough to want to do good things. To become a scholar, you have to think rigorously. You have to consider opposite viewpoints. You have to take the evidence seriously. This value of peer review, of criticism, of seeing criticism as service rather than an attack. So all those virtues of scholarship, I think Oxford made me, well, first it sharpened and honed my own scholarship. I owe a lot of my intellectual temperament to Oxford, but also the softer virtues that nobody sort of spells out for you, but you sort of imbibe what academic freedom means, what it means to be devoted to truth above all else, as a vocational and a professional matter. So Oxford changed all of that in a deep way. My undergraduate education was different in India, in Bangalore. It was very exciting. It was a lot more oriented towards politics and law, and I was involved, as a student who was interested in his place in the world, in a lot of student movements and student political movements. If you're not a radical in your late teens and early 20s, then there's something really sad about you. So all of that was great. I've kept that devotion to the devotion to why I chose the life I did. So the mission was set in India. Oxford taught me how to do it well.
That's so interesting, because I think one of the things that I find really cool about your work is that it does have the kind of burning passion of an activist restrained by the critical thinking of the scholar. And something I'd love to hear more from you about is this kind of dual identity that you have forged for yourself. It's not something that you do see often, right? We meet a lot of people day to day who are activists or scholars. And in some ways, it seems to me that the temperaments really clash. Like on the one side, the activist has to have a degree of certainty about what they stand for, and they need to pursue that with heart and with conviction. Whereas the scholar is trained in self-skepticism, trained in doubt, trained in restraint. What does it mean to be both a scholar and an activist? What does it mean to navigate that tension? What are the responsibilities, the comparative responsibilities of those two identities? I'd love to hear more about that.
Sure, Jack. So my self-identity is that of a scholar. A scholar of the world and in the world. So, and that's true of a lot of my colleagues. The ivory tower stereotype is just that, a stereotype. Is not true, right? But the tensions you identify are real, because a lot of my colleagues get into the academy because they have activist passion, right? And they want to make the world a better place than they found it. So, and as you say, the tensions are real, because the first virtue of the scholar is truth, and the first virtue of the activist is justice. And yes, in the long run, they meet, but not always, not necessarily. And sometimes strategically, it may make sense to bend the truth to get to justice quicker. So those are compromises that I would never allow. The scholar in me will never allow to be made. In some ways, I think that my fidelity to truth and to the scholar in me, and this may sound weird, but makes me a better activist.
Yeah.
because crafting a sense of identity, um, which others start taking seriously because they can see it in your work, of an uncompromising devotion to truth, um, is always more effective uh, as a strategic matter as well,
Mm.
um, because you're taken more seriously
Mm.
than if you had an image of somebody who is so committed to an objective that any means
Mm.
will suffice. So in some ways, uh, even the pragmatic or strategic tension uh, melts away if you take a long enough view. If you accept that I'm a little human being with the ability to change very little in
Mm.
this world, perhaps with a minor discursive intervention, uh, but I'll do my bit, and if
Mm.
that lets you sleep properly at nights, you just play the long game and say, putting truth out there, somebody sometime someday, maybe after you're long gone, will pick it up.
Mm.
And you're working on Burkean, you know how ideas have a life 2 centuries down,
Yeah.
or many or millennia after they're expressed, right? So as long as you're not impatient about change, in that can be hard, and I'm
Mm.
certainly not against activists. I think that the world needs many more passionate activists for the challenges that it's facing. But the more pragmatic compromise that the activist and the academic within me have reached is that the activist gets to choose what I work on. So this is my Indian education,
Mm.
right? Having seen the strife, the discrimination, the oppression, the suffering, and some of it is biographical, a lot of it is experiential based on what I've seen. Um, the activist chooses what I work on as a scholar, but then the activist must shut up. Then
Mm.
the scholar has to take over. Right? Uh, what questions you ask, how you investigate, um, all of that has to satisfy the rigors of my discipline. It has to stand up to the criticism of my peers. And if I'm not doing that, I'm being a bad activist and a bad scholar.
Yeah.
Uh, so and once I have written things and published them, then if there is um, an engagement value in what I've done, I would then do translation work. Recently I've been engaged in a literal translation by doing these Hindi podcasts on constitutional theory, but by translation I just mean remembering Aruna Roy's very sage advice of making my work more accessible
Mm.
through interviews like this one, by writing in newspaper op-eds, translating my scholarship for a wider audience,
Mm.
and that's that's the activist's job. But that happens after the academic process
Mm.
uh, has been gone through, and after the scholar is convinced that what I'm putting out in the world is something I can uh, put my name to and not be embarrassed by.
That's really powerful. It's helping me, myself start to think about my own journey in the way that I start to see those identities as working together. So the activist creates, or the reformer creates, the kind of conviction to fight an issue, and then the scholar distills that, and that separation allows you to be a little less certain about your views, to critique them from all angles. And then the activist's responsibility comes back to communicate that to people in a way that's actually going to benefit their lives. And that's very interesting. I've never heard anyone else articulate that last bit, that bit about communication, like what we're doing now. And I mean, let's have that opportunity then. Let's begin to speak about your work on discrimination law. So you wrote a theory of discrimination law in 2015. It received many accolades, many awards. It's a wonderful book. I've read it myself. It's got a very interesting argumentative structure, which is highly original, but we'll get to that in a moment. Maybe if you can just reproduce the essential argument of your book in non-legal terms? I think that'd be really useful for our listeners just to start off.
Sure. So when I started working on the book, people talking about discrimination law, the debate was very tribal. The scholarly debate, but also the activist debate was very tribal. It still is in many ways, but there were two groups. One group who saw discrimination as a procedural protection for individuals against irrational decisions made by employers based on irrelevant features like your race or your gender. The second camp saw the point of discrimination as solving societal, deeply entrenched societal inequalities faced by social groups, like racial minorities, like women. And so one of my abiding maxims as a scholar, of course, sometimes it is wrong, but often when intelligent people disagree about a matter, and in a long-standing disagreement, chances are that both sides have landed upon some part of the truth. So I think my book's big insight was, and again, even that methodological turn that I use in a book is borrowed by other scholars like John Rawls and H.L.A. Hart. But the key insight, the key framing insight in the book was that these two camps are actually asking two different questions. And they're both right in their answers, but they're not answers to the same question. And the two questions were, why should we have this practice, this institution of discrimination law in the first place, right? This is what H.L.A. Hart called the general justifying aim of a practice, right? Why should we have it at all? And to that question, it was the second group which was giving the right answer, which was that we live in a society where women and religious minorities and racial minorities and LGBTQ people and Dalits and all sorts of other social groups live worse lives than their counterparts, racial majority and upper caste people, etc. Right? And their lives were worse, not in a trivial way, but in a significant, in a substantial way. So the difference, we're talking about aggregate statistical numbers here, but the difference between these groups was vast. It did not affect just one or two areas of human life, right? It wasn't just in employment or just in education. We saw the same differences between the same groups occupying the same position in the hierarchy in almost every sphere of human activity. You look at healthcare, whether you look at mortality rates, whether you look at education, employment, political representation, we see continuously the same patterns being replicated, and that these patterns seemed to be enduring over time. That generation after generation, these patterns were stable. And that's why we need discrimination law, because humans have had different blood groups for as long as, I'm not a scientist, right? But I'll just make this claim out there that I'm wrong, please, somebody who knows better correct me, right? Humans have probably had different blood groups as long as humans have existed. But we see no difference in what are the chances of our lives succeeding based on whether you're a B positive person or an O negative person. I don't even know if there is a blood group called O negative, but anyway. So that is why we need discrimination law. But the way discrimination law seeks to solve this societal problem is through a process curing, individualized, fault-based mechanism, which is what the first group, was focusing on, right? But that is not asking the question, that is not answering the question, why do we have discrimination at all? The question there is, once we recognize the need to do something about these substantial, abiding, pervasive social differences, how do we go about solving it?
Yeah.
And you can have different views there as well. And this is one approach, right? And suddenly it made so much sense to me that these groups were in some ways talking past each other, answering different questions, but not realizing that they were answering different questions. So I hope that at least
it does.
answer your.
So would you say then, in terms of, because that's what struck me when I read the book, was it the structure of its argument? So, I mean, I might be misreading this, but it seemed to me that you started off conceptually, like you were asking essentially a what question about what is discrimination law, like what do non-lawyers think and what do lawyers think as well, and then you move to this why question, this normative question, and you grounded that why question in individual freedom, but then the kind of following how-to, if you like, the distributive question was, how do we actually, fix this intractable group systemic problem? And what struck me about that is you're using different modalities. So it feels like the first two parts are more legal theory, and then the last bit is when you move into the legal analysis. What are your thoughts on the interaction between those two distinct modalities? Because I don't you don't see a lot of legal theorists or philosophers or lawyers integrating their approach in that way. But this speaks to how we might actually affect what Edmund Burke would call philosophy in action. So what do you think about the relationship between the legal theory and the legal analysis?
It's interesting that you invoke Burke here because because the second part. So having identified the problem, so I start in the book by thinking about what the law is doing here. So my starting point is very different from what a sociologist might see as a starting point, right? A sociologist will not take a body of law, which is discrimination law, and say, how do we use this to understand the phenomenon of discrimination? She's more likely to use the methods of her discipline to figure out what discrimination is, perhaps by looking at the phenomenon from the perspective of those who are discriminated, or those who feel they're discriminated, and those who are doing the discrimination. Right? But law, as a human artifact, as human practice, is often interesting as a human response to perceived human problems, and therefore, while it cannot, tell us everything we want to know about a phenomenon, it sometimes can be quite revealing. So I started by asking, look, here is law that several jurisdictions have evolved, often in conversation with each other, in remarkably similar ways, with key differences too. What can we learn about the phenomenon from the law itself? And as you noticed, the way the law had evolved was starkly different from what the general population, by general population I very much mean the dominant groups, perceive discrimination to be, because discrimination is so controversial in our society, both for epistemic reasons and for reasons related to power. And obviously they are linked, because power and knowledge are interlinked, right? But dominant groups tend to find discrimination as a procedural defect in individual decisions based on irrelevant features more attractive, because that view taken on its own is less threatening to power, but also it foregrounds the mental processes of the discriminator, who is often somebody who belongs to a dominant group. So so as long as in my thinking I have not been prejudiced, I'm not racist, I'm not sexist, I have not discriminated. But the law in some jurisdictions mainly in the latter half of the 20th century, there's been a lot of pushback recently, came to adopt the viewpoint of those who experience discrimination rather than those who perpetrate it, right? Who experience discrimination in structural ways, in hidden ways, in the subtle ways that power operates without being exercised. So the people who claim they are not discriminating are not lying. They genuinely believe they are not discriminating, and still discrimination operates because, power is the ultimate self-enforcing phenomenon. Power begets power, and power perpetuates itself, power aggrandizes itself. And when power feels the need to become subtle, it can become so subtle that it's not only those who are powerful, but even those upon whom power is exercised cannot perceive it. So this is Stephen Luke's work on power, but this is what in the Marxist canon would be called hegemony, right? It becomes imperceptible, and that's power at its most powerful, not least powerful, right? So that is part of why discrimination is such a difficult phenomenon. But when I connect that, the legal, drawing a sociological reality from the legal response to the phenomenon and figuring out a normative framework for why this is legitimate. And the normative framework was that it makes a difference to the likelihood of success of your life, right? Connecting that to the legal response was, I suppose, unconsciously on my part, Burkean, because the legal response part is not a normative story, right? That's an explanatory story of how do we best explain the law that we have on discrimination, right? And there is no claim in the book, and it'll be difficult to sustain that claim anyway, that the way the law responds to solving this hugely intractable, enduring, widespread, substantial advantage gaps between social groups can be solved through these individualized process curing approaches, right? I think that if you really want to solve that, a much more robust legal response is necessary. However, and this is where your institutional dynamic comes in, politicians are problem solvers, are pragmatic people who can only push solutions so far, and also incrementally, right? So when you are up against power itself, when you're trying to dismantle power itself, you will have to work around power, you have to co-opt power, and you have to pick your battles. Right? And this is not a point about moderation or a normative commitment. This is a strategic point, right? Because power by its nature will win when threatened. Right? Power can fight back because it's powerful, right? And to expect that you can win. So anyway, as a matter of
fascinating
political strategy, it makes sense to hoodwink power by making the powerful as well as the powerless groups both equally protected under the law, getting co-option from power by changing discursive norms around power. So, for example, telling companies that a diverse workforce is good for business. Right? So these are all discursive and legal interventions that complicate power's ability to fight back. Power has, of course, fought back, right? Because that is the nature of power. But don't underestimate, we cannot underestimate the gains that the law has made in instituting the anti-discrimination norm in the last 40 years in so many democracies, so much so that nobody likes being called a discriminator. Right? It's an insult. And that expressive success, that normative success, I think counts for a lot. And,
Mm.
in some fields like LGBT, well, maybe not T yet, but LGB rights or rights of people in non-traditional marital relationships or cohabitation, discrimination law has made astonishing
Yeah.
strides. Right? But others, like race and gender,
Mm.
have remained stable. And I think the next intellectual agenda is to figure out why the law has been so successful
Mm.
on some fronts and not so much on others.
I mean, that's really, really interesting, particularly how you said, when Burke uses that phrase, philosophy in action, he says that it's an ends means question. So, the end here is that normative point, and that's what we were just discussing before about why we're doing something. But that means question about how we strategically counter power through our institutions is where this question of reform comes in, right? And let's talk about this in a concrete context, because you said that what we have to try and do is use the expressive power of the law, its spirit, if you like, its potential for as an instrument of cultural change. What we have to do is use the law in that way to try and generate norms that someone can then pick up in the conversation in the history 40 to 200 years down the line and move with for practical change that people will live with. Tell us about, Tarun, your experience with the Anti-Discrimination and Equality Bill in 2017 in India, because I think that's what you did. But our non-Indian listeners might not know the context of that. So if you could just maybe introduce that and then reflect on what the expressive norm-generating power of that bill was.
So India remains one of the few democracies today, well, a flawed one, and increasingly more complicated in claiming its status as a democracy, but we'll put that to one side, which does not have a comprehensive anti-discrimination law that regulates discrimination in the public and the private sphere. So in 2017, I teamed up with an opposition MP, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, to introduce in Parliament this comprehensive bill. And we knew that there was no prospect of it actually passing. Because private member bills from opposition MPs don't pass generally in parliamentary systems, and and with a very hostile government. So this bill was very much intended to be one that would start a civil society conversation. And it was placed in the public domain. I spent about 3 or 4 years consulting activists and academics and lawyers and various groups within India. I made multiple trips, did a lot of workshops in India leading up to drafting this bill. But I'm not a public institution, and Tarun Khaitan has done enough consultation. Is certainly not, a reason to accept that that's how it should be drafted, right? Public, democratic, responsible institutions need to consult. So I would not have liked the bill to be passed in the way it was presented either. The point was to start a public discussion, and that did happen. It did get picked up by the media in a big way, and then academics started using it for teaching in their classes. And now there are 3 or 4 bills. All other civil society groups got interested. They used that bill as a starting point to think further about the issue. So some state governments are thinking about whether to bring in legislation. So the conversation has begun, and which was the intention behind the bill. I'm enough of a Foucauldian to believe that knowledge is power, and ideas do matter. So I can't. Yes, I can't. I don't have the capacity to pass a law to prohibit discrimination because I'm not an elected public officer. But what I do is seek to make slight discursive change here and there. And who knows when what will change. But the idea that the bill is there in the public domain, conversations have begun, may well have helped somebody use it to force a norm change in their institution, and that's success.
Mm. And see, I want to talk a bit more about norm change, because I've just finished reading The Annihilation of Caste for the first time, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's, the Dalit leader, inspirational leader of India, who wanted to abolish the caste system, a very, very intelligent man who drafted the Indian constitution, if I'm correct. His point in that book is that at the heart of the Indian cultural character, at least in 1936 when he's writing, is the idea of discrimination. And he's speaking about the Hindu caste system and extrapolating from there. How can reformers even start to generate cultural change in institutions or nations where prejudices run so deep? Like you said in your commentary around this bill, that this bill seeks to realize Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's vision of what India is. I guess the question is, what do you think India is in line with that vision? And do you think we might see cultural change that will bring the people's hearts in line with that vision in the next whatever time? I know it's a big question, but I'd be really interested to hear what you have to say about that.
Sure. So India has many things. India is not in isn't it's a defining feature of India to be many things. And I think British Prime Minister Churchill meant it as an insult, but I see it as India's badge of glory when he said that India is not a country, or India is as much a country as the equator is a country, right? And obviously he was making the point that it's just wildly, unmanageably plural. I think if there is any essence to the idea of India, it is that reality of staggering pluralism that is undeniable if you have spent even an hour in any right? So that is both simultaneously a virtue and a curse, because India is, yes, there is astonishing discrimination in India, and yet there is an India that is so much at ease with pluralism. And I know that this might sound extremely jarring in the current context, where we have an almost fascist political discourse as the mainstream discourse, right? But the first time I heard in the UK a British Prime Minister, David Cameron, claiming we are a Christian country, my Indian sensibilities were shocked, because until India's current Prime Minister, no Indian Prime Minister would ever be heard, at least not publicly, saying we are a Hindu country. And that was a strength. That was India's strength, right? The performative multiculturalism of India, again, recently dead, but until recently, every Indian Prime Minister, we used to mock it, right? And we used to say this is such a low-hanging fruit, right? To performatively wear essentialized symbols of multiple religious groups and multiple traditions on religious holidays, or you're visiting the hinterland and you'll wear the dress, right? All of that, there is, as an Indian, I feel nostalgic about it, but also living in a country which is unself-consciously steeped in its own homogenizing and unself-consciously hierarchical narrative about the superiority of its own majoritarian ways of doing things. So I think that the idea that India and by India, I mean not just the Indian state, right? But India is somehow lagging behind, and some of the Western countries are the leaders on this discrimination front. I think that has to be complicated, because India has a lot to teach countries like the UK and much of Europe on being comfortable with difference and pluralism, and be embracing what might look embracing the bizarre and the eccentric. So that innate, I don't even know if tolerance is the right word for that. That innate normalization of the eccentric, what might be eccentric to you, that is a strength. But that is absolutely not to deny the horrendous ravages of discrimination that so many Indians faced when Dr. Ambedkar was writing, and continue to face today. So it's a complicated story. There are pluses and there are minuses, and we have to acknowledge our civilizational strengths while we berate our differences. But also Ambedkar is connected to the previous conversation we were having about the normative goal of justice and the pragmatic, strategic constraints of what's possible. And Ambedkar is a fascinating character because in his life, he is the radical outsider for most of his life, right? Mocking the system and pushing the system to its limits and demanding the system to live up to a set of moral precepts and virtue. And yet, when he takes office for those 2.5, 3 years as chairperson of the drafting committee of the Constitution, he's big enough to recognize the burdens of office and the pragmatic, and I don't use pragmatic as a bad word here, the burdens of getting things done while in power, right? Where he adopts a very, one could say, incrementalist approach to what the Constitution does. And when he leaves office, returns to his radical roots, right? And disowns the chairperson Ambedkar, calls himself a hack who did what he was told to do. But I think he was an intelligent man, right? And he understood the importance of principled pragmatism. Right? So change requires the radicals. Change requires the passionate activists on the streets, because it's the extreme that defines the center, and therefore those who are closer to the center, the moderates, become acceptable to the reactionaries because the extremists exist. So I, for any Joe Biden, to use contemporary politicians, any Joe Biden owes his office to a Bernie Sanders, right? And we've seen, Ambedkar in his single life played both characters. Often these roles are played by different people. But incrementalists need the radicals, but radicals also need the incrementalists. Forget this, right? Because incrementalists are the people who leverage the radicals and their push to nudge things away from power. Right? Is the fear of losing power that radicals put in the heart of the powerful.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating because Ambedkar, on the last 3 pages of The Annihilation, quotes Burke, and he says, he quotes Burke as saying, "A state without the means of some change is without the means of its conservation." And Ambedkar is trying to remind the Indian people of who they really are. And that's a phrase that you've used before. in your writings. And I thought that was fascinating because it acknowledges that there is an ideal inherent in a people that comes to them by way of their traditions and history and customs. But that ideal is always at stake. It's always contingent on the behavior of people in the ecology today. And in that ecology, there are the reformers, the radicals, and then the centrists kind of being pulled, in the middle to that balance point. And you mentioned earlier in our conversation that we have to watch out for subtle power. And you said we have to watch out for subtle power because it creeps. It's not in your face. It erodes that ideal very gradually, incrementally. It's the dark side of reform. It's the dark side of conservatism. And that, to me, is what's happening in India today. And you have said this in your work as well, that since 2014, under Prime Minister Narendra Modi and BJP, particularly in the first term of office, there was an intentional, systematic, habitual attempt, a choreographed attempt, I believe you say, to try and undermine Indian democratic institutions. I guess I've got two questions from that. The first is, you've been writing about this a lot since 2014, 2019. Do you have a faith in Indian institutions, democratic institutions, in their ability to withstand that subtle assault? And second, do you think that the tactics of the Modi government have shifted in this second term of office? Is the power still subtle, or is it something else now?
I'll start with the second question because it's an easier one to answer, which is that I think Modi 2.0 is no longer incrementalist. I think the confidence, one may say, the overconfidence that comes with winning a second election overwhelmingly, with better numbers than the first time around, and overwhelmingly in seat terms. The BJP's electoral votes in 2014 were a 31 odd percentage, and in 2019 were 36 odd percentage points. So it's still nowhere close to a majority of the people. Even so, in our system, the votes are over translated into seats. With that self-confidence has come a self-belief in the government, it seems, that we don't need subtlety and incrementalism anymore. So what we have seen since 2019 is a much more naked, full frontal, crass use of state power. So incrementalism can serve many masters. Right? Incrementalism is a strategy that was discovered by progressives to chip away at power, mainly because they thought it was the easiest way to deal with power. But like every progressive tool, reactionaries have discovered it too. And there is no reason why you cannot use it's a mechanism. It's not the goal. There's no reason why you cannot use incrementalism to move in the opposite direction. I think as an Indian citizen and a watcher of Indian politics, I would think of a government that is incrementally undermining democracy to be far more dangerous to the idea of India than a government that is doing it openly and unashamedly. It's not surprising, and it's not a coincidence, that the large-scale protests over months that we are seeing in India year after year began in 2019. That the first term, because it's very hard to rally against incrementalism. It's very hard to organize around it because, the paper you mentioned, I called it, killing a constitution with 1,000 cuts. You can also build a democracy with 1,000 cuts. Or 1,000 band-aids. I don't know what the equivalent metaphor is. But But it's hard to organize around it because there is no big ticket organizational reform that will get people on the streets, or that will get your opponents to rally behind a cause. So it's always more dangerous if it's happening in the direction that you do not like. So I think that they have made a strategic mistake. Now, I hope that they're not listening to, I don't think they're listening to this podcast. I hope they're not listening to this podcast. I don't want to be advising them to return to incrementalism because, when power is always there in our lives, and it's better when we can see power for what it is. A wolf in sheep's clothing is always more dangerous than a wolf. So I'm glad that it's there to be seen in its true form. On whether Indian institutions can withstand, that's a more complicated question to answer.
Yeah.
Right? And anybody looking at how the institutions have stacked up over the last 6-7 years would probably only be able to give a pessimistic response, which is that, most institutions have either been captured or compromised or willingly adopted this new political agenda and are going ahead with it. So, but I think that's only part of a story. Democratic ideals have a strong and long-term roots in Indian psyche and also Indian civil society. So I think while state institutions have mostly capitulated, not all, by the way, right? So I think some federal institutions are still standing up. But again, as somebody who's interested in institutional reform, I think there are big design flaws as well that we have.
Yeah.
We have not empowered the opposition. The political opposition is the canary in the coal mine when it comes to threats to democracy, right? They smell it first because for them it's a question of, it's an existential worry. So any system that does not empower the opposition to put the brakes on, and the Indian system does so because it's federal, but that's limited. And I think a serious conversation on opposition rights needs to begin. And, again, now I'm writing about opposition rights, translating those ideas.
Do you think that, as far as I know, the opposition's not written into the Indian Constitution? So I think the problem that you write about in your article is that BJP, for example, is able to appoint to fourth branch institutions and the like their own people because that voice is not mandated. Just really quickly, what do you think needs to change in terms of reform for the opposition to be empowered? Is it about the Congress reorganizing themselves and taking a look at themselves? Is it a party solution, or is it more a design change? I'd be interested to hear what you think that actual change might be.
So how the opposition will gain power is a political question, and they have to unite. The Congress has to. The Congress is on a death wish, right? It has to deal with the leadership problem. 6-7 years after electoral defeat, and then defeat after defeat, they still haven't managed to solve their internal problem. It's a huge issue, and not just the Congress party. It's not a fiefdom. Indian democracy is at stake. So there is a political question and there is a legal question, right? Which is, when the Congress is in power, will it empower the opposition, which will be the BJP, right? But, democracy, as Professor Tarunabh said, is a system where parties lose elections. Right? And every ruling party has to imagine itself in the opposition and create a system that gives it the space that it would like to have in the opposition. So that's long-term and rational thinking. But to get there, the opposition will need to get into power first.
And that's the political question. Yeah.
That is the political question.
Well, Tarun, it's been an absolutely wonderful conversation. I'm so honored to have spoken with you. I'm really glad we got to cover all of that ground. So thank you for going a little longer than we had planned. But thank you for your work. Please, everyone who's listening, please go and read Professor Khaitan's work. I'll be sharing it around. I'll be sharing it with this podcast. I think it's really important, original, and it's good to see activists who are able to adopt the role of scholar and to come and to benefit from all the things that come with that. So, Professor, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much, Jack. Can I rephrase your last description, which is perhaps what you're saying is a scholar who is sensitive to the activist needs of the world.
Exactly, a scholar who is sensitive. Thank you, Tarun.
It's a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.